This video will help you understand how a trust can help protect you from creditors and lawsuits. If you don't know who I am, my name's Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. So the simple answer is a revocable trust will not protect you and an irrevocable trust will. If you want further nuance than that, stick around, let's jump in. So when it comes to the estate planning section of a client's holistic financial plan, oftentimes protecting one's assets can be a major concern. And specifically, this is on protecting one's assets from lawsuits, creditors, etc. Now, outside of the general best practice of don't break the law and don't fall into more debt than you can afford, sometimes the uncontrollable occurs and you find yourself on the receiving end of a lawsuit, or you find yourself falling on hard times where creditors are hungry for some assets. One of the most popular strategies online to shroud one's assets from these third parties is to place these assets that you want to protect in some form of trust. Now, not just any trust, however, but an irrevocable trust, aka a trust that is its own separate entity and doesn't have direct ties back to you. For a quick refresher, there's two types of trusts. There are revocable trusts and irrevocable trusts. As the name implies, revocable trusts means you can revoke them, but really it means you can make changes while you're still living, etc., and you still have unfettered access to the trust assets. Whereas an irrevocable trust has its own EIN, which is basically a social security number. It might have its own tax return, and it's viewed in the eyes of the IRS as a separate entity. A revocable trust, since you have unfettered access to it, does not help you by way of protection from lawsuits or creditors, etc., because that all is still considered your assets. Whereas an irrevocable trust, once things are moved irrevocably into that trust, you are no longer considered to still have control over those assets. And therefore, those assets are protected from creditors and lawsuits, etc. Now, you might still be the beneficiary of said irrevocable trust and might still benefit from the trust income and distributions and things like that. However, since you don't have full control, aka you're not the trustee yourself of the trust or the manager, then those assets are protected from creditors. Unless, of course, the creditors can show that this irrevocable trust is really just more of a revocable trust, but trust contest is going to be a little challenging there. Now, there's other strategies out there to protect one's assets from creditors and lawsuits, etc., and that could be things like forming a business entity like an LLC. As long as you're not commingling the funds and you've got all the proper documentation in force to show that the LLC is a separate entity from yourself, even if it's a single-member LLC, the buck stops at the LLC by way of creditors and lawsuits who are trying to sue that particular business entity. You could also do something very simple like buy umbrella insurance. These policies can be good for millions of dollars of potential lawsuit protection. Now, they won't necessarily help you by way of getting out of debt. However, they would help you in the form of a lawsuit where damages are being requested. And there's also things like you could look into some specialized insurance or specialized legal protection. For example, if you carry a firearm, there's firearm insurance and things like that to help you if you find yourself on the wrong side of a lawsuit for a very specific circumstance. But let's say you've decided to move into the direction of setting up a trust to protect your assets. Now, what kinds of trusts would do that? Well, as we already established, those would be irrevocable trusts. And some common examples of those would be things like special needs trusts, Medicaid trusts, or even self-settled asset protection trusts. The point is that they're irrevocable, and generally they'll have a particular purpose for why these assets are being placed there. It generally is not advisable just to create an irrevocable trust and move a bunch of stuff into that unless there's a rhyme or reason. So why wouldn't everybody just go do all this and protect their assets from creditors? Well, there is some downside. Number one, of course, you'll have to hire an attorney to help draft the irrevocable trust documents. Theoretically, you could do it yourself, but odds are if you're of means where it makes sense to place assets in an environment where creditors and attorneys can't get access to it, it might make sense to hire an estate planning attorney to help make sure that you've shrouded your assets appropriately. Think of it like a form of insurance. Another downside is since these assets are no longer under your control, well then you can't use them for your own personal financial gains or business dealings necessarily. Now you might still benefit from the trust by way of income or distributions and things like that, maybe health, education, maintenance support, for example. But you wouldn't be able to use it and post it as collateral for a particular business dealing that you're doing on the personal side. You very much are giving up liquidity because you're moving this asset that could be leveraged into an environment that you can no longer leverage it. For example, let's say I own a rental property and I'm going to post that rental property as collateral so I can get this business loan set up and go do maybe another venture. If counterfactually I move this rental property into an irrevocable trust for asset protection, well, the bank is no longer going to let me use that asset to post as collateral for this business loan. And on the flip side, let's say I was already using this asset as collateral for a particular business loan. If I move that asset out of my name and into an irrevocable trust, the bank could very much call my loan because I no longer meet the financing requirements of having a certain level of, debt to equity ratio, for example. This is easily seen if you have something like a line of credit, for example. For example, in a securities-based line of credit, you have to maintain a certain level of assets relative to the amount of the line of credit. And if the account value dips too low, then the bank might call that line of credit and you'll have to make up payments immediately. And that means you'll probably have to go sell something else on your balance sheet at a loss, or at least not at a very advantageous time, to make up the liquidity to pay off this line of credit. I'll link above to my previous video on securities-based lines of credit if you want more information. But the point is, in the attempts of making yourself more asset protected, you might have actually made yourself more asset vulnerable because you have less liquidity. Another downside to moving assets into the irrevocable trust is you could have some downstream deleterious estate planning effects. For example, any assets that you own, even if they're in a revocable living trust, those assets, if they're non-retirement assets, would get a step up in basis at your death. Now, depending on whether or not you're in a separate property or a community property state, those rules will be a little bit different, but the fact of the matter is, at death, your property gets a step up in basis, either partially or in full, depending on which state you're in. That means that the $100,000 home I bought in 1970 something that's now worth $1 million will be totally stepped up to $1 million as of my date of death. That means my heirs could theoretically turn around and sell the property and pay no capital gains tax. However, if I move this piece of real estate into the irrevocable trust to protect it, and then eventually I die, which everybody does, I've heard, you will not get a step up in basis on those assets. The house will have a carryover basis from whatever mine was when I gifted it to the trust, and then when I die, there's no change to that basis. And that means the beneficiaries, if they did want to turn around and sell it, they'd have to realize those capital gains that are embedded in the total value minus the basis of the property. So in this scenario, in the hopes of achieving greater asset protection, I actually cost my heirs far more in taxes. Now, is it possible for assets in a revocable trust or assets that have been willed via your will to loved ones, is it possible that those could still be protected and shrouded from creditors and lawsuits? And the answer is yes, but not while you're alive. For example, a revocable trust today does not provide you any sort of asset protection, but upon your death, that revocable trust becomes an irrevocable trust, and now any assets that are inside that trust are protected from third parties. In addition, your will might explain that at your death, you'd like testamentary trusts to be established to hold certain assets and things like that. Well, testamentary trusts are irrevocable because they're created after you're gone and you're no longer around to make decisions anymore. So the assets that are going to be held inside these testamentary trusts, since those trusts are now irrevocable, now they benefit from protection. So revocable trusts provide you no protection, willed assets provide you no protection today. At your death, they become irrevocable, and now we're back to square one where assets held inside of an irrevocable trust are protected. So calls to action wise, I would see if in your financial plan it makes sense to move some assets into an irrevocable environment to benefit from protection. Generally, you'd want to move them in there if there's other estate planning objectives that are coming into play. I don't see a lot of efficacy in moving property into irrevocable trusts purely for the protection of it all. Generally, there's some other reasons to consider moving property into irrevocable trusts. Keep in mind, this move is irrevocable and you can't change your mind once it's done. If that sounds a bit too sophisticated or it might not apply, there's definitely some other ways to approach getting asset protection, like forming an LLC or most simply just buying umbrella insurance. So those might be some avenues to check out before you decide to hire an attorney and move some stuff irrevocably. So hopefully that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. We'll get you squared away. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.